Welcome to the Serena t-shirt sew along. The first thing we're going to do is print and cut out all of the pattern pieces. Tape them into rows and tape the rows together to form one collection of your pattern pieces. Then rough cut the pattern pieces and then take those rough cut pattern pieces and carefully cut along the cutting lines. This is what the pattern pieces look like. This is a good time to double check your measurements before you cut your fashion fabric. Choose the stretchiest direction of your fabric for this pattern for the waist direction. Once you've found that, line up your pattern pieces, mark, and cut. Be sure to transfer the marks on the pattern to the fabric itself. You'll see these are little lines in the seam allowance. I cut right up to, but not on the sewing line. Here's the sleeve pattern. You'll notice the sleeve pattern has a notch at the top, a single notch on one side, and a double notch on the other. That's because our sleeves are fitted front versus back. So you need to line up these double notches and single notches onto your bodice. Here you can see the double notch, which matches to the back piece, and the single notch, which matches to the front piece. The first seam we're going to sew is the center back seam, which is a curved seam. This piece also has notches for the waistline and at the top. Pin the seam away from the seam allowance and the stitching line. I pin it about 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches away. That way I don't have to mess with the pins when I take it to my sewing machine or my serger. I'm going to sew with a 4-stitch safety stitch, but you could finish the edge or simply use a sewing machine using a stretch stitch. Here's a little trick. This notch, I cut into a long seam when I'm using my serger. And then I insert the notch edge right into the serger foot. I'm only neatening up the edge because there's a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I am not removing the pins because they are well out of the way of the feed dogs. Go ahead and clean up your little tails. Remove your pins. And this is what the center seam looks like. It's beautiful, nice, neat, and finished. And there's the center back. The back piece is now ready to be attached to the front piece of your bodice. Open up your back piece facing right side up. Lay your front piece right side down and pin the shoulders. We're going to stitch it as we did the center back seam, but we do not need to take a notch because the seam is so short. These are the 2 shoulder seams you will stitch next. Here's your garment back from the sewing machine, and the shoulder seams have been sewn. Next, we will put our sleeves in. Open up your garment right side up, and that will reveal the circle for the neck hole that you can see there, as well as your armholes. We're going to be matching the center notch of your sleeve head to the shoulder seam you just sewed. Check those notches. This is the back with the double notch. Check your sleeve. You want to make sure you match the double notch to that side. This is the single notch. It goes to the front. This is the double notch. It goes to the back. Right side down, match your sleeve to the sleeve opening. There's the center notch, match to the shoulder seam, and pin. Next, pin the side seams. There is no ease for the sleeve head and the sleeve opening. So be careful to pin it generously along that sewing line. We're going to go ahead and pin both sleeves and then baste along this line first. Again, we're not easing, we're just matching that edge. It should match up perfectly. Once your sleeves are pinned into the sleeve openings, going to take this to our machine and baste a straight line to attach these temporarily to the bodice. Baste your sleeves along this seam line here. This is what it looks like back from the sewing machine. I've used a contrasting thread because I want to remove this later. You don't have to, but here it is in black. Both sleeves have been basted into the sleeve opening. You can see it's starting to look like a garment. The next thing we're going to do is take this to our machine and permanently affix the sleeve to the bodice. I'm going to use a 4-thread safety stitch on my serger. If you use a sewing machine, be sure to select a stretch stitch because the seam will get a lot of stress. Here's the finished seam using a matching thread. You can see the contrasting thread, which we will remove later. I'm going to now remove that basting thread. Carefully pry those stitches up. They're long, so they should be pretty easy to remove. This will also give you a neater finish. Repeat on the other sleeve seam. Now that the basting thread is removed, you can see how nice that seam looks like on the inside of your garment. It's neatened up, the notches match, and the edge is nicely finished. You don't have to finish the edge of a knit, but it does look better. The next seam we're going to sew is the side seam. This is the seam from the sleeve edge all the way down the body. Now, we need to carefully match the intersecting seams that are already sewn, and that's where the sleeve was just attached. You can see your notch marks, and we'll be pinning those in a minute. But first, we're going to focus on the intersection. There's the notches, and this is the seam we're going to sew. The intersection can be matched very easily by taking a pin and inserting it, the stitch in the ditch section, and we want to force one seam allowance to the left and one seam allowance to the right. Here's how I like to make sure these intersections look nice. I take the seam allowance, line it up as best I can. From one direction, I want to poke right in that seam, right in the ditch. Then I'm going to go to the other side of the fabric and poke it again right into the other seam. This might take you a couple of tries. Once you've got it where you're satisfied, move one seam allowance to the left and one to the right so that they are facing different directions. Use your pin and you can come at an angle and press that seam allowance down. Now, if you need to, take a second pin. Let's go ahead and pin the rest of this stitching line, matching the notches. Repeat on the other side seam. Let's take it to the sewing machine or the serger and sew this seam right here, all the way down on both sides of your garment. And here it is, finished and looks great, nice and neat. You can see the notches match up. The seam looks great. It's all clean and the seam is secured with a 4-stitch safety stitch. This is really starting to look pretty. Let's turn it inside out. Take a look. That's our waist matching up nicely. There's our back center seam. Okay, we're ready to finish this back center seam and the neckline. Carefully measure around the neckline. Do not stretch as you're measuring. Note the final number. We're going to need to divide this in half. You can do the math, or you can do it the way I do it by simply folding the tape measure in half. Choose the direction of fabric that has the most stretch to cut your strips. I like to fold my fabric in about 4 layers. True it up with a clear quilting ruler. Make sure those fabric layers are nice and flat. And then measure 2 inches in. If the first line that you cut to true up your fabric doesn't cut through all 4 layers, just go back and try again. I am going to cut 2 2-inch strips because we need a strip for the sleeves as well as the neckline. You might as well do them both now. If your strips have the selvage edge, go ahead and remove that. You don't want to accidentally put that in your beautiful neckline. This is how your strips are going to look. You can fold them in half to get an idea for how wide that neckband and sleeve band will be. So here's my trick again. I measured 28 inches. I'm going to fold my tape measure in half to get the exact halfway mark. This happens to be 14 inches, but it could be any increment. I'm going to subtract 1 inch from that measurement. 14 minus 1 equals 13. Fold your neckband in half and cut this measurement on the fold. This will be used for your neckband. With right sides together, sew the short edges together. This forms a loop. Optionally, you can join the raw edges together, as I mentioned before, with a narrow zigzag. This will get you the most consistent result when you attach this neckband to your garment. Once you have the circle cut and sewed to the right length, fold it in half so you can mark the center front. The center back will be the seam. Take your garment and matching the shoulder seams, fold it in half and carefully take a tiny snip in the seam allowance to mark the center front. This will help us place the neckband perfectly. With your garment right side out, take the neckband. Match the seam on the neckband to the center back seam of your garment and pin. Find the center front of your garment, where the notch is, and match it to the pin in the neckband and pin. Remember, we cut the neckband shorter than the neck opening, so we're going to take those 2 pin points, stretch out the neckband, and carefully mark all around the neckband with pins. You can pin as generously as you like. We're going to take our time attaching this neckband to the garment. Once you're satisfied that you have enough pins and the band is attached securely, we will take this to our sewing machine or serger and attach the neckband. Here you see, again, a 4-thread safety stitch from a serger, but you can use a zigzag stitch and finishing zigzag on your sewing machine. See how pretty that looks? We're also going to tack down the neckband so it lies flat in the next step. This is a good time to clean up any loose threads from your sewing machine or your serger. Before we do the top stitching along the edge of the neckline and onto the garment, I like to take my garment and just give it a little press with a warm but not hot iron. The top stitching serves 2 functions. It tacks down this loose raw edge, which makes it more comfortable to wear, and it adds a nice decorative element and gives a finishing touch to the exterior of the garment. Top stitch all around the neck edge with a very small zigzag so it'll also stretch. I'll take you step by step through this process. Now the edge that we're concerned about is this one that sticks up. That's the finishing of your seam allowance. Test some narrow zigzags on your machine. Here I'm using black so you can see the stitch. This is a real narrow zigzag. And we'll be sewing from the top of the garment. Press your seam allowance away from the band. And you can feel the seam allowance as you're sewing from the front of your garment. And we're going to take that zigzag and just catch up the very edge of that seam allowance. That's going to be our top stitch. This is sewn on the body of your bodice, not on the neckband itself. Here's an example. I'm just sewing this little scrap so you can see how this is done. Sewing on the bodice of the fabric, catching up that seam allowance, just a little tiny edge away from your sewing seam with your zigzag. That's going to be your top stitch. Here's what it looks like on the back. You see how this raw edge has been caught up in the zigzag? Now look, it's lying flat. You can't even see it on the inside, which is really nice, but it's caught up the very tiny edge, and it's going to stretch as you wear it, and it's going to lie flat and be a lot more comfortable than having that raw edge sticking up and irritating your skin. So let's take our garment to the sewing machine, and we're going to repeat this process. It might help to have the free arm adjusted on your sewing machine, but it's not absolutely necessary. I like to start my top stitching from the center back seam. Here you can see the beautiful intersection we pinned and sewed before. Making sure that seam allowance is pressed towards the body of your garment, starting from the center back seam. Sew a narrow zigzag which just catches up the edge. You can feel it with your fingers. Take your time and sew a top stitch all around the neckband. And here's what it looks like when it's done. It's beautiful, it's simple, it's functional, and it's going to add some enjoyment when you wear this garment because the inner seam allowance is now pressed flat. So you won't have that edge rolling up and annoying you. Clean up your loose threads now. You can see how the edge now lays nice and flat, and you can't even see the top stitching from the inside. I recommend that you repeat this process for the center back seam. You don't have to, but I find that it just adds a little more comfort when you're wearing the garment. And here's where we're at. The top stitching is done. It looks beautiful all the way around. The center back seam has been tacked down, so it's nice and flat. And it looks just like the other top stitching. And here we have the hemline and the sleeve openings that need to be finished. Now you can just turn this under and be done, but I like to add a sleeve band just like we did to the neck. To do this, you need to measure the sleeve opening while it is folded. Do not stretch your sleeve opening, just lay it as flat as possible, push the tape up against it, and take note of the measurement. We want the sleeve band to be a little snugger than the sleeve, so we're going to subtract 1/2 inch from this number. Cut 2 bands on the fold using the measurement, and then sew the short edges together just like we did for the neckband. And as we did for the neckband, we're going to take our little sleeve cuffs, fold them in half, and mark the halfway point with a pin. For best results, zigzag the edges of the sleeve band together before you attach it to the garment. Mark the center of your sleeve by carefully folding it in half from the underarm seam. Take a little snip at the center point. If you'd rather mark it with a pin, that's fine too. We will match up the cuffs right side out to your garment using these 2 points. The cuff seam will be matched to the underarm seam of your garment. The notch will match the center point of your cuff as marked by the pin. Pin your cuff to the garment, starting with the underarm seam matched to the cuff seam. pin that point. Find the center point of your cuff, which you previously marked with a pin, and match it to the notch on your sleeve and pin that point as well. Pin around the opening until you're satisfied you have enough pins. It won't take a lot. Repeat for the other sleeve, and using your sewing machine or your serger, attach the cuff to the garment. Press the seam allowance towards the garment, and then top stitch just like we did to the neckband. Here's how pretty this looks. It lies flat, and it won't irritate your arm as you wear the garment. Plus, it looks great from the outside. We've reached our final step, and that is the hemming of our blouse. Now you can just turn it up twice and hem it and be done, but I'm going to show you a trick to make that curved hem look really nice. Run a basting stitch along the hem of the garment. Turn up 1 inch and gather. Ease the curved edges where you've gathered, pin in place, and press with a warm iron on these curves so they lie flat. With the gathering stitch and the iron pressing, you're going to get a nice smooth finish on that hemline. Now you don't have to do this, but I really like this trick because it is going to give you a nice smooth hemline. You've probably seen those wrinkled hemlines even on ready to wear. It irritates me so much, but this will prevent that. Once you've done this step, you can finish the hemline by zigzagging that 1 inch edge in. Go slowly, remove the pins as you go, and you'll be done. Optionally, I'm removing the excess fabric that is beyond the seam line. You don't have to do this, but it looks nice if you do. You can zigzag this. I used cover stitch, but you don't have to do that. I've done plenty of these with just a simple zigzag and been perfectly happy with my garment. This is what it looks like when it's done. I might give that hemline another press before I wear it, but otherwise you're really ready to go. This is the beautiful Serena blouse, the fitted t-shirt that's going to look fabulous with any outfit. Enjoy, and thanks for sharing this sew along with me today.